With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, let's go back over to the UK because there's nothing major going on over there lately, if you even tangentially look at the headlines. But important topic. I'm looking forward to this. New face from our UK contributor, Sophia Worringer, is joining us from the UK. How are you, ma'am? Thank you so much for the time.
Thanks so much for having me on. Great to be here.
I appreciate you. Another one of our great Young Voices contributor. Also does some other things in her own right. We'll get to that in just a little bit. Well-traveled, too. Always appreciate that. You wrote a piece about the Queen, and I know people are like, well, why are we still talking about the Queen? I want to set it up this way to you, though, because when I talk to people that work in and around Parliament, when I talk to our UK friends while that was all going on, yes, to the American audience, yes, it's mostly ceremonial. Yes, it's, there's not really political power there. But when I talk to the people that actually work around, the constant of the Queen, the steadiness, the fact that she is the titular head of state, that was a real thing to Parliament. It was a stabilizing force in some ways. She dies, we have total chaos. It's not all just because of that, because it's economics and other things. Is there a little element here like this may not be as chaotic and as vitriolic as it was if the Queen was still there? Because everybody I talked to said that stabilization thing was a very real thing.
I think you're right in some ways. I think the Queen's constant presence over most of the last century now, and 70 years on the throne, was definitely a stabilising presence in Parliament. Obviously, she would open it every new parliamentary session. She only missed 2 or 3, I think, when she was very ill or heavily pregnant. And she was therefore a constant presence. And I think also a national focus of identity, of direction, of ceremony and tradition. And although her successor, King Charles, embodies much of that, his presence on the scene hasn't been quite as constant. And so therefore, I do feel like we have maybe lost some of that reassurance and steady hands. And I think as a national figurehead, she was incredibly unifying, and she would not get involved in the nitty-gritty of politics. She would not comment on political day-to-day activities, and her unifying presence will definitely be missed. And maybe there can be links drawn to the economic turmoil we see ourselves now in, but it may have to have more hindsight to exactly express how those things are connected.
Yeah, Sophia Worringer joining us. I think it's one of those passive things, though, of when you have somebody that's that revered and that respected and that beloved. I think there was something to it of just, well, you don't want to ever embarrass or let somebody like that down. It's a passive thing. It's not like something that's talked about. You don't get a memo at the beginning of Parliament sessions like, don't embarrass the Queen. It's just understood that, hey, when we do stuff, don't embarrass the Queen, don't embarrass the country. There's an element of that we are losing in societies. We're losing it in America, certainly. That kind of institutional thing. The British are kind of, y'all got that stereotype, stiff upper lip, carry on. You got the T-shirts, all that stuff. Is there a concern some of that might be a little bit slipping here, that we're maybe decorum's kind of becoming an issue a little bit?
I do think the UK public showed that extent of their love and devotion to the Queen in the outpouring of grief following her death. And obviously the eyes of the world turned to Westminster as the funeral was broadcast. And I think people were quite surprised maybe about how emotional they became upon hearing the Queen had died. People who had never met her, people who had never even seen her. And I think there was something about that collective experience of loss in the country that has probably disorientated a lot of people over the last few weeks and caused people to be anxious about the future, to question what is Britain's place in the world. And I think the combination of changing head of state and changing government, changing prime minister happening all very quickly after a very kind of tumultuous few years in politics anyway, has definitely had an impact on the national psyche and has left many people feeling rudderless. So it's very important now that the king and the government, in whatever form that takes, puts emphasis on unity and moving forward and forging a new path for Britain. We can't replicate the Queen. King Charles cannot be his mother, but he can forge his own path, and it's really important that he does that.
Yeah, we'll talk about the political turmoil a little bit more in a minute, but y'all need some unity right now, and you're probably going to have some dark days before you get back to it. Let's talk about the Queen for a minute, because you were writing about it. You wrote about American Thinker. We'll read the whole piece. She also has a bunch of links inside the piece. You want to make sure you read through those too. When you're somebody like the Queen and you've been on the throne for 70 years and you have movies about you and you have prestige TV series about you, can't help but be a stereotype. We talk about it being marbleization, you know, the famous figures, they got their statue and you never get to the actual person underneath that. But you wrote about this. That person, the stereotypes didn't always hold up. You know, they talked about her being very traditional, maybe not being, you know, progressively feminist, but she also had a husband who famously, you touch on it in the piece, always walked 2 paces behind her. Like, you know, some of the stereotypes do match up, some of them don't. Walk us through a couple of those that you pointed out in your piece.
So I think what's really interesting is the Queen was both very traditional and yet also very reforming. So I've talked about the changes she made to the Crown succession of the Crown Act in 2013, which undid hundreds, if not thousands, of years of male preference primogeniture, where the line of the throne succession passed to the eldest male. She undid that so that any child of Prince William, who is now Prince of Wales, would be equally in line to the throne, whether they were born a boy or a girl. And that's actually very radical, particularly when you think of all of the disputes in history about not producing male heirs and all of the ways our country's history is shaped by this male preference primogeniture in the past. And she quietly undid that. And I think showed in that her very radical reforming agenda, but always in step with honouring tradition. And I think, therefore, some of the accolades around her, calling her a feminist, are correct in that she did believe in equality, and at the heart of feminism, that is what is believed, but not in the way modern liberal feminists often discuss feminism, which blurs the distinction of maleness and femaleness and gender. And I think actually the Queen, as well as being reforming in some ways, was very proud of being a female ruler and proud of her femininity, and so therefore stuck to more conservative values of her role and understood her role to be very one of protecting institutions and conserving institutions. So in both hands, she was both conservative and reforming, and I think she bridged that gap very well and walked that path very smoothly.
That's Sophia Worringer joining us from over in the UK. Part of this is a perception issue because, you know, everybody's like, well, she was a very traditional woman. Well, by 1950 standards, she's pretty progressive. By 2022 standards, she's super conservative. How much of it is her own evolution? She reigned for so long that she spanned different eras, but she wasn't the same either, and not just because of age. She changed over time too. It was more subtle. It was more on the down low. Get us past the media perception, because I think when you look at it that way, it will change how we view her as a person first. That, hey, when she came to the throne, unexpectedly, by the way, people forget that part of it. She wasn't expecting to be queen when she was. It kind of got thrust upon her. There was a lot of change, even though it was subtle. And by the standards of her time throughout her lifetime, massive change and massive ways that not only the royalty and the royal family, but the way she presented and represented her country changed as well.
Absolutely. She did in some ways represent this conservatism, this tradition, but as I mentioned, evolved into her role and saw the monarchy as evolving with her, I believe. And I think what is interesting is that the modern liberal feminist movement actually seeks in some ways to be more conservative, more traditional, more regressive than it portrays itself to be. So I mentioned in my piece the decisions to portray Joan of Arc and to understand Elizabeth I as a gender neutral, non-binary character. And I think actually those expectations actually put what it means to be a woman into a smaller box than the Queen allowed it to be put into. So those interpretations look back at strong female leaders in history and see that they displayed characteristics which were for that time unusual, such as having a female head of state in the case of Elizabeth I, and having someone address an army, in her case, the army going to defeat the Spanish Armada, or Joan of Arc, who led wear men's clothes, she led an army, she went to speak to the king. All of those characteristics, modern liberal feminists are in danger of looking back at people like them and deciding that because they displayed these strong characteristics of leadership and courage and decisive strategy, they could not possibly be female, hence the decision to portray them as gender neutral or non-binary. And yet the Queen Elizabeth II, actually was more comfortable in her femininity than that their definitions allow. So she was very comfortable, obviously, in her finery, in the crown jewels, in her dresses and fur and feathers, but more maybe comfortable in her country clothes, rolling around in the mud, stalking deer around Balmoral, right? And we need to be very careful that we don't define leadership only through male categories. And she was able to decide that she was a leader and she was strong and she was female, and she didn't want to minimize that, but she was very comfortable with the definition of female extending to full military dress or deer stalking or all these different types of things, which modern liberal feminists are in danger of categorizing only as male. So I think in that sense, she was incredibly progressive. And I think therefore the modern liberal feminist movement is actually and ironically in danger of becoming more aggressive. I know that's not their intention, but with their narrow definitions of gender, they are in danger of that. And that's why it's so interesting.
Yeah, Sophia Worringer joining us. You have a great anecdote in here, is something of a little bit of a lighter note because it's a heavy topic. It was jarring to the American audience and the international audience when you saw Princess Anne in the funeral procession in uniform, which kind of surprised some folks. And then there's, of course, the controversy that, Harry couldn't wear his, but we'll deal with that some other time. But you have a great little anecdote about Princess Anne having kind of and she was basically the caretaker of the Queen. She was the Queen's right hand. She spent more time with her than anybody else. She was with her every day, especially in the last few years with the health stuff. She was basically the caretaker for all practical purposes, for folks that don't know. But Princess Anne had that same kind of high-minded, I'm here, I'm doing my job, that kind of day-to-day bravery stuff. But you had an interesting little anecdote about the time they actually tried to kidnap her, and it did not go well for that guy.
Yeah, exactly. So the Royal Princess Anne is the only daughter of the Queen, and she's known for her no-nonsense approach. And there was an attempt to kidnap her from when she was driving in a car, and the person who attempted that got into the car, and she told them to go away, basically, very bluntly, told them that they were a silly man and that they should go away. She took no hostages at all. She was very clear what she wanted. And I think that has shows something of the Queen as well, because their relationship was so close. It was the Queen's wishes that Princess Royal would follow the coffin from Balmoral to Aberdeen, where it was flown to London, and she did that whole 6-hour journey in the car behind the coffin. And what is actually really interesting too is I saw the hearse and the coffin leave from London, Westminster, to go to Windsor, which is the outskirts of London, and it came near my house, and the rest of the royal family were ahead of the coffin in their cars, and then the coffin came, and then the Princess Anne followed the coffin in a separate car. And I do think that shows something of the closeness of the relationship between the Princess Royal and her late mother, and that would have been a request of the Queen. So the no-nonsense attitude that we see in the Princess Royal, I think she learnt definitely from her late mother, and we can understand more about the Queen by understanding more about Princess Anne.
Yeah, Sophia Worringer. There was nothing in that funeral that wasn't planned out and approved down to the smallest detail. So yeah, stuff like that was absolutely not accidental. Let's come back to the present day. The Queen is gone. We had the respite from UK politics. We had the great, 10 days or so of national unity. Boy, howdy, that went away real fast. There's an economic crisis. There's a cost of living crisis. There's migrant crises. There's all kinds of crises. Let's just be blunt. There's a leadership crisis in the UK right now. I know Liz Truss came in with a really hard hand. It looks like it's going even worse than people feared it might. There's a leadership crisis in the UK right now. This is why I opened up with, even though she's not technically have political power, just having that steady and influence might be really missed right now. What's the state, just common folks on the street? What are, obviously you follow politics maybe more closely, but what do people think? Because the average person that doesn't follow policy and economics and politics, I got to imagine they're just looking at that and going, this is one hot mess of not good.
I think the public have now a fairly short fuse for political antics. Obviously, the summer was taken up by a very insular leadership race where only MPs and then only members of the Conservative Party could vote. And therefore, most of the public looking on felt excluded from that and didn't have much patience for all of the briefing and counter briefing that was going on during that race. But they were willing to put up with that because they felt like stability would be delivered at the end and there would be a leader that would take them forward into this new chapter. And I think the Prime Minister now needs to be incredibly clear with the public about her direction. If she wants to completely continue to pursue this direction of tax cutting and growth, which obviously the UK needs. The UK does need growth after we recover from the pandemic. That is very important. She needs to be clear in her communication. And I think the problem has been is that she has moved too quickly for the public to keep up. And at the end of the day, people are going to look at the money that's in their pockets, right? They're going to look at their mortgage rates, which are going to be fixed for 2 or 3 or 5 years at a very high rate. They're going to look at how much money they have left over at the end of the month once they've paid their energy bills. And so I think economic fiscal responsibility is incredibly important. But even more important than that is the communication of the policies of where the country is going and the direction and vision for the country. And I think that's what's been lacking over this tumultuous period, is that the country has not been taken on the journey of why these cuts or growth is important, and therefore there's been a disconnect between the policies and the communications, and therefore people feel very confused, very in the dark. And most of the people in the UK, rightly so, are not in the Westminster bubble. They don't read the newspapers every day in incredible detail. They will just look at the headlines. And so it's very important that the government communicates very clearly and very top line as what's going on, so that people can go on this journey with them.
Yeah, Sophia Worringer joining us from the UK. If this turns into a longer term economic crisis, let's say past next year, past 1 or 2 elections, we're going to probably wind up with a general election sooner rather than later somewhere in here. If this turns into a multi-year recession, God forbid, or this just doesn't seem like it's going to end, does this go from just being a political crisis to being a transformational moment for the UK? Because it kind of is starting to feel like people are not just questioning leadership, they're starting to question the parties, they're starting to question the structure. The UK's role in the world is evolving. The demographics of the UK are changing. There's a lot of things moving at once in the UK right now. Does this feel like something that this may be a crisis that goes beyond just solving the crisis of the moment? This might be a generational change type of moment.
I think so, because I think the death of the Queen was always going to be a seminal moment in UK identity and understanding of belonging, direction, and national pride. And I think now that that has happened, we are left with this landscape, which is fairly unshaped, of who we are on the global stage. What is our role? What does it mean to be British? What are British values? And I think following, obviously, from the Brexit vote, there are still quite severe divides between various people and geographical entities in the UK. And I think, therefore, we are at a crossroads as to who we are and what we stand for. And I think there's been very quick cultural change as well in the UK. If you think in comparison to America, for example, we are a very small population and we've had very big demographic shifts. We've had cultural and value shifts that have been almost over less than a decade, very quickly changed. And I think our sense of unity has not kept up with the sense of change. And so therefore we are definitely at a crossroads, and it's important therefore that we tap back into what it is to be British and what holds us together and really focus on that.
Yeah, Sophia and Worringer, crisis always reveals. So it'll be interesting to see what our UK friends come out the other side of this crisis looking like. And we do hope our special relationship continues, because we sure do enjoy our friendship with y'all. Appreciate the conversation. Love talking about this stuff. Appreciate your insight. Till we get you back on the show in the future, though, let folks know where they can follow you, what you have going on, and how they can keep up with you until we get you back on Heard Tell again.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at Sophia Worringer. I'm working at a think tank called the Centre for Social Justice, looking at roots in and out of poverty in the mid-2020s. So you can follow the work of the Centre for Social Justice online too.
Yep, and we'll link to her page, Young Voices, and also her social media. You're going to have plenty of business on that poverty thing, because it looks like it's going to be tough economic times for the foreseeable future. So good luck with that. Thank you so much for the conversation and the time, Sophia Worringer. Thank you very much, ma'am. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, topic we've been touching on off and on because people keep talking about it. People keep doing things about it. The president did something about it. And now we got it thrown into the court system. So this is going to be a mess for a while. Here's who we're going to talk to it about. We're going to talk student loan debt with Tyler Curtis. He's a Young Voices contributor. He went to Missouri, although for the purposes of this conversation, we will not hold that against him because he's good people's. Tyler, how are you today, sir?
I'm very good. How are you, Andrew?
I appreciate it. Did you take out student loans? How'd you get through school?
Well, I tried my very best not to. But then my very last semester, I took out a very small student loan, about $1,000, and paid it off a few months after I graduated. But I just made it. I worked my way through school, a couple different jobs, had a scholarship here and there. But yeah, I did have one little loan.
All right. So here's the thing with student loans. It's just to intro it. I didn't have student loans, but I had my military benefits, both TA while I was active duty and then the GI Bill after I got out. So I did it differently too. So just biases on the table. That's where we're at on this topic, because the first thing everybody does is, well, did you pay yours back? Did you ever take one? You can still talk about the policy here. You wrote a solutions piece in the Waco Tribune. Here's what I want to do, though, because we've all done this. We write these solution pieces. We sometimes kind of gloss over what the problem is. The student debt issue is multifaceted. So for the purposes of the solution you're going to propose, just break us down what you're seeing as the problem to get to your solution, because we don't put those things together sometimes as commentary folks to our own detriment. Define the problem for me before we get to your solution as you see it.
Okay, so I think the problem is actually twofold. So you have, on the one hand, more and more people are taking out student loans, and the people that have student loan debt, their balances just keep increasing. And the flip side is that tuition keeps rising, and they're actually interrelated. So as tuition keeps increasing, people have to take out more and more loans to pay for it. And as people take out more and more loans, as financing becomes more available, tuition rises because the availability of financing means that colleges can increase their tuition without decreasing their revenue, so that they can keep having more and more enrollment even as they increase their prices. That's kind of the problem there. We're also seeing default rates on student loans increasing. Depending on what source you look at, it can be anywhere between 5% of borrowers that are more than 90 days delinquent, to even in some cases double digits. There are some communities, I just read a study the other day that they found that in Philadelphia, the student loan delinquency rates were anywhere between 10 and 15%. So we're seeing people that they take out all of this debt and they just can't pay it back.
Yeah, Tyler Curtis joining us. I come at it from this point of view. Part of the problem with the inflation of the system is because it has become predatory. Everybody's funneled into this thing where you have to go to college. You're not going to do anything unless you go to college. You're not going to get a good job unless you go to college. So you have to go to college. And if you can't afford college, too bad, go get a loan, put yourself in a bad financial system. That's part of the issue too, is the predatory system of this. How do you put those two things together though? Because it's inflating, but it's not inflating naturally. It's an artificial inflation of the system. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, I think it is. And you talk to a high school student today, and they'll tell you that the amount of pressure they have on them to go to college, even if they don't want to or they think it's not the best thing for them, it can be really tough on them. I remember when I was in school, there were certainly options given. You could go to trade school, community college, but the last thing that you wanted to do is tell a teacher that, or an advisor, that you were just going to go right into the workplace. It was just verboten that you had to go to college of some sort, especially a 4-year university. They were really pushing for that. And if you can't, I mean, the affordability problem was just, it wasn't really talked too much about. You just sign up, you fill out the FAFSA, you get grants that you're eligible for, you get scholarships that you're eligible for, and you take out loans to cover the rest. As far as looking at prices of different universities, I don't know that there was a lot of guidance provided on that at all. And I think if you ask high school students across the country, most of them would say that they're from their school advisors or college advisors. No one's really talking about prices at all. You may even go up to a college student and ask them today, hey, how much are you paying for your tuition? They might not even know, just because they type a form and they fill it out online, and oh, here's how much the deficit is from my scholarships. Here's how much I owe. Click student loan, sign, done. So they're probably not even aware of the true cost of what they're paying.
Yeah, and that's probably part of the problem. Tyler Curtis joining us. Okay, so you decided to wade into this. I guess you decided you'd made enough friends online. You thought you'd throw a grenade. You came up with an idea here. Are you serious that you think we should put down payments on these student loans? Pitch it to us. What's the idea here?
Well, it's sort of a compromise. I think if you listen to conservative and libertarian commentators, you'll hear a lot of people say, well, the solution to the student loan debt problem is to just get rid of federal student loans. So the federal government shouldn't be involved in financing college for anybody in any form whatsoever. So if you want to take out loans, you should just go to private lenders that charge really high rates. So this is sort of a compromise that we can allow the federal government to continue financing college tuition for students, but the students themselves are going to have to cover part of that cost. So just like if you go buy a house or a car, typically the lender will require you to make a down payment of some sort. It might be a really small percentage, it might be a bigger percentage. But a lot of loans do require that you put some sort of cash down, and student loans at this point do not. You can get, there are a lot of federal student loan programs out there that have different requirements, but none of them require that you pay any of your own money down on your college expenses. So you can go to school, you get your scholarships, your grants, parents pay for part of it, whatever it is, and the federal government will cover the rest. Under my proposal, the students themselves or their families would have to put some cash down. They'd have to have some skin in the game in order to pay for their college tuition. I don't have a particular percentage in mind. In my piece, I think I talked about a 20% down payment. So this, depending on where a student goes to school, that might cost them a few $100s. It might cost them a few $1,000s. But the point is that if you're going to get these really low interest, generous federal student loans subsidized by the taxpayers, you ought to put at least a little bit of your own money down when you go to college.
Tyler Curtis. This piece is in Waco Tribune Herald. We're going to link to it. Read through the whole thing. Read it for yourself. Make up your own mind. Let me throw you some of the pushback. The immediate pushback on this is going to be like, well, the whole idea of student loans is for people that can't afford college in the first place. So obviously they probably aren't going to have the money for down payments. This is becoming a gatekeeping thing. This is going to become a class thing. This will become, disparate people groups are going to get filtered out. There's no way that accusation doesn't have some merit to it. So what's your answer to that?
Well, my answer to that is the federal government already provides pretty generous financial assistance to people that come from lower income families in the form of Pell Grants. For everybody else, I think we need to be honest about the implications of this. And it is true that people that come from lesser means probably won't be able to afford the same expense as they were before. But that doesn't mean that they won't be able to go to college at all. I think that requiring a down payment for student loans will encourage people to think more about the prices that they're paying. So sure, you might have somebody that comes from a family that's a little bit less well off there. Maybe they're not going to be able to go to that private university 3 states over anymore because they just can't afford what the down payment would be on that. But they would still be able to go to college somewhere closer to home, probably a public university. So we're certainly not saying that someone won't be able to go to college at all. But the other issue is that we're talking about people that are going to college to get accepted into a university to begin with, especially one that's really expensive, probably going to have pretty good GPA, probably going to have pretty good ACT, SAT scores. So in that case, those students are going to qualify for scholarships. So you're talking about if we have a hypothetical student that comes from a family that doesn't make a lot of money, maybe they make just enough to not qualify for a Pell Grant, but they don't make enough for their children to go to college, for the family to pay for the college. So those are people that you might see falling through the cracks. The ones that don't qualify for Pell Grants, but their parents don't make enough money to pay out of pocket for all of their college expenses. Well, I think that we've overestimated how difficult it is for people to pay for college expenses out of pocket. So yes, we've seen tuition rise much faster than the general rate of inflation, but it's certainly not out of reach for a lot of students to pay for college out of pocket if they're working. So even part-time work or full-time work, it's not impossible for them to work and go to school at the same time. So we've seen college tuition rise over the past few decades, but it's not risen so fast that it's completely impossible for people to work and pay for their schooling out of pocket. So I talked earlier in the program about how I went to college. I paid for a lot of it out of pocket. I took one loan out my last semester. I worked part-time, 2 part-time jobs that sometimes added up to full-time hours. So I was able to pay for my schooling out of pocket. And I went to a college that their tuition was pretty reasonably priced. But I think speaking from my own experience, it's not that difficult actually to go to school and work at the same time and pay for everything.
Yeah, Tyler Curtis joining us. Of course, the rebuttal to that is going to be, well, sure, it was easy for you. It's not easy for everybody. If we're going to say this is a predatory system, why should we have a solution that has the burden on the victims of that system and the people having to pay into it? Why aren't we having a solution that is on the part of the system that's the problem, which is the university system and the financial folks that are funneling all this money? What do you say to that criticism?
Well, I mean, I understand where that criticism is coming from, so I get the perspective, but the only way, well, I would say that forgiving the student loans, even if you think that some of them were predatory, if we were pressuring students to take out loans that they were not going to be able to pay, or loans that they really didn't want, but they consented to anyway, the only way to fix that is to is to forgive that debt like the president did. But it's really not fixing the problem at all, because you're not really forgiving the debt. You are getting rid of the debt, but you're requiring taxpayers to pay for it. So you're shifting the burden from those that took out those loans to people that didn't. So if there's anything predatory going on, it's the federal government saying, hey, you guys that didn't take out any loans, or you people that took out loans and paid them back, now we're going to tax you even more to pay for people, to pay off the student loans for people that consented to them and now no longer want to pay them. So
Yeah.
I would say that the taxation is really the taxation to pay to cancel student loan debt is more predatory than the student loans are themselves.
Yeah, Tyler Curtis joining us. You touch on it in the piece, but I think this is another one of those, look, when you do a solutions piece, you got to have answers for the solutions, right? So we're going to throw a couple of these at you. You talk about it. This becomes a supply and demand kind of thing. You're changing the demand. Well, the fairness folks are going to start screaming, well, it's not fair for people to not get the chance to get this higher education, which gets you into a different job bracket, which gets you and on and on and on. How do you answer the fairness argument? Because there's no version of doing something with a down payment that doesn't turn into a gatekeeping exercise, either monetarily or otherwise. So how do you deal with the fairness argument, which again is specious and it can be whatever anybody wants to be fair? That's what's going to get thrown at it, is this isn't going to be fair.
Well, what's really not fair is trying to make college an entitlement. So if your perspective is that everybody should have the opportunity, regardless of their grades that they got, regardless of their career opportunities that they'll have after college, if everybody should have the opportunity to go to college and the federal government should give them that opportunity, then it's really become an entitlement. And if it's an entitlement provided by the federal government, that means that it's really provided by the taxpayers. So I would say that yes, it's kind of a catch-22. It might be unfair for certain students not to be afforded the opportunity to go to college because they're required to pay for some of it up front, and they may not be able to afford it. But it would also be unfair to tax people who were never given the opportunity to go to college because they didn't get good enough grades to get in, or because they just didn't want to. Maybe they didn't feel like it was the best thing for them. Maybe they wanted to go right into the workplace. Maybe they went to a trade school, learned a skill. They never took out student loans in the first place. I think it would be unfair to them to say that everybody that goes to college needs to have it 100% paid for by the federal government.
Yeah, Tyler Curtis joining us, talking student loan debt. You ended your piece talking about, and we're debating this back and forth and giving you some of the pushback because again, we understand this is a complex issue that's not going to be a single thing fixed. There's going to have to be multiple things to happen here. This is one idea that you have for part of it. You ended your piece saying, if we're serious about reducing tuition costs and student loan debt, we need to think outside the box. Well, we know why nobody's thinking outside the box, because all the money's inside the box.
Yeah.
And the whole system is built to make money and to funnel kids, because funneling kids makes more money. Your proposal aside, though, big picture wise, we keep talking about, well, maybe Big Ed's a bubble that's going to eventually pop. I don't know if that's going to happen or not because there's so much invested in it. We talk about technology changing things, people being able to do different ways of going to higher education. What do you think is going to get people outside of that box? Because one way or the other, what we're doing now doesn't seem to be sustainable. So what's going to be the catalyst, do you think?
Well, I think actually, ironically, the president's student loan forgiveness plan is the catalyst to spur conversation about why there is so much more student debt now than there used to be. But like you said, the problem is that nobody's really talking about the root causes. A lot of the solutions on the table are to help people that already have student loan debt. So you see a lot of proposals like allowing people to discharge student loan debt in bankruptcy court. And I think that's a fine idea, but it doesn't really address why it is that people have more student loan debt than they did in the past. So it's going to help people, allowing them to discharge it in bankruptcy court will help them, people that are financially struggling after they've already taken out debt. But it doesn't prevent students from taking out loans in the future. The president also proposed lowering the minimum payment requirement on the income-driven repayment program. Again, that helps people that are struggling to make their payments now, but it doesn't prevent students from taking out more loans in the future. Senator Marco Rubio and a couple of other Democratic senators have a proposal to eliminate interest rates on federal student loans. So again, that's going to help people. That would help people make their payments and would help them to get their loans paid off. But it doesn't help them not go into debt in the first place. So I think requiring students to make a down payment on their college tuition is one way for us to start to see a decrease in the astronomical amounts of student loan debt that students have accrued over the past few years. And hopefully it helps future students from falling into that same debt spiral that so many people find themselves in today.
Tyler Curtis joining us. Since you wrote the piece, it's been out for a little bit. It's at the Waco Tribune Herald. Again, we're going to link to it. You need to read it yourself. Been out about 2 weeks now. What's the pushback you get? What's some of the, because obviously this is an emotionally charged issue on top of being a trending viral one. And of course, the president's got gasoline on it now. We're going to have some court cases about what the president passed. What's some of the pushback and feedback you've been getting since you wrote the piece?
Yeah, I get two major pieces of pushback, and one is what we talked about earlier, is that it would prevent people from going to college that otherwise should be given the opportunity to do so. And I think that's just that's a valid line of criticism. But the way I answer that is just to say, if we look at the affordability of college, we can see that it's really not out of reach for people to pay for at least part of it themselves if they're working. But the bad thing is that so many college students today aren't working. If you look at rates, employment rates amongst college students over the past couple decades, we're seeing a pretty stable downward trend. But if the students were working, it's really it would certainly be difficult, especially if the tuition that you're paying is really high. But it's not out of reach. If you look at college tuition in 1991, it was about $3,000 to $4,000 for an in-state public university. The federal minimum wage was about $3.50 an hour. So it would take you about 1,200 hours to pay for a full year of your college if you're paying 100% of it out of pocket. If you're going to college today, it would probably cost you about $10,000 for an in-state public university. So at today's federal student or federal minimum wage is about $7.25 an hour. Most states pay well above that. But let's just say you're working at the federal minimum wage. It would take you about 1,400 hours, a little bit over 1,400 hours to pay for $10,000 of tuition at that rate. So it's not that much more expensive, and certainly if you work and live in a state that pays a higher minimum wage, such as Missouri, I think it's about $11.25 an hour, $11.50 an hour in Missouri. It would actually be more affordable if you're working at a minimum wage job to pay for college today than it was in the 1990s. So that's how I would address that criticism. The other criticism is that like you said earlier, some people would fall through the cracks. Their families make too much money for them to qualify for federal grant money, but they don't make enough money to pay for their students or pay for their kids to go to college. But that's part of part of the plan's benefit too, is that if fewer people go to college, it lowers the demand for college. So prices should come down, just as the simple working of supply and demand.
Yeah, Tyler Curtis, read the piece for yourself. Controversial idea, bad mess of a problem. So somebody's got to start doing something out there. So I don't mind people throwing ideas like this, because then we can hash them out and discuss it. We ask you hard questions about it. You answered them. Appreciate that. Till we see you on Heard Tell again, let folks know where they can follow you, where you got stuff going on. We will link to this piece and all your other social media, but let folks know where they can keep up with you until we talk to you again, my friend.
Well, they can follow me on Twitter at Tyler Curtis 42, at TYLERCURTIS 42 on Twitter.
Yep, and we'll link to that as well. We'll see him again. Keep probing, though. It's always good to write those things to get people talking. That's how you'll get stuff published. Well done, my friend. We'll talk again soon. Thank you, Tyler Curtis.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, sir.
I drop bombs, now let me see you go off like a bomb.
That'll do it for Heard Tell. As always, love to hear from you. heardtellshow@gmail.com. You can send us an email, Heard Tell Show on the Twitter. You can DM us and follow us there. Also, my Twitter handle, for the Fire, and those of our guests is always in the lower third graphics. If you're watching on the YouTube, if you're listening on the podcast, there'll be links for you to follow both the writing of the folks we have on and us and our social media. This only works because you listen, and we so greatly appreciate you. So wherever you are, across the street or around the world, we hope you and yours are well. We hope you are well fed. We can't wait to see you again for more Heard Tell. All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.